This would be the kind of thing you can do. You can see the curved laminations in there. They're very subtle on this particular bow. All right, that's one thing. There's a lot of things you can do, and that's up to your own creativity. But bottom line is that you need to know a process that you can do it and glue it together and still have proper adhesion. Now you can cut a curve in a riser with a bandsaw, put a thin lamination in there and clamp it back together, but the coarseness from the bandsaw blade is going to make it not be the very best possible strength and glue adhesion that you could have. So anyway, so that's what I'm going to show you today, is a method to you can do any kind of curve. So what we're going to do is we're not going to do the fancy curve, because that's a lot more work and takes a lot of time, but you'll know the process and you can make anything you want. This is a jig that I use for making those curves in a riser like you just saw. Okay, give you how it looks, and I'll explain all that as we go along. But first and foremost, you have to come up with a curve you want to put in your bow. So for today, we're going to start with something very simple. It's a curved riser. All right, so that means on the face of the riser, it has a curve, and it's not a straight faced riser or anything like that. So you, of course, have to have all that stuff done. But what I'm going to do is, just for simplicity, is I'm going to put the same curve that the face of the riser is, the laminations, the bow, I'm going to put that into the curve of the bow. Goes like this. Inside the riser, you have the same curve. All right, so that's what we're going to show you. Just something simple and different, as opposed to having plain old straight laminations, which are great to do. They're simple to do. You can make a real strong bow with them and all that. But you know, after you've built 20 of them or something like that, you're going to want to do something different. That's what we're going to do today. This is a test riser. I don't recommend you do all this and just jump right in and cut up some really expensive cocobolo or whatever your favorite hardwood is. I went and I had a 2x6 out in the shed, and I cut this down to the block size of what my riser is going to be. And I also got out my template for my riser. All right, so that's the first thing I did, is I did that. And after this is just simple carpentry stuff. So then what I've done is, for the base of the jig, I use high density MDF. Okay. Whatever you can get will do the job. This stuff was available to me. It's really dense, it's very flat, it's really good for jigs and stuff. And on this particular jig, I'm using 1/2 inch. I don't need a big 3/4 inch chunk. Some jigs you want a larger, thicker piece of wood. So anyway, this will do perfect. And then I cut a piece of maple the exact size of the board we just did. Next, I laid out on the piece of wood, hopefully you can see it here, it's pretty light. Okay, so all I've done is I took the piece of wood that's the size of a riser, I placed it on here, and I drew the line in here, and I'm making it darker so it can be seen a little more easily. Now you can see there's the line there. You're going to need that because ultimately this block is going to go right on there and be fastened in place. And then after we cut the curve in this piece of MDF, and we've cut the curve out of the bow riser, that's going to go in here to go in to be routed or sanded or however you're going to do it. All right, we'll get to that in time. But that's the process so far. Place your template on your riser block. Lay in the face curve of this particular bow. If you have a straight back bow and you're doing this curve, well, that's okay. Just leave it straight, and then we'll draw a curve in. Rather, this part here is all going to be cut out. And now I'm going to just draw my bow template on here where I can determine where I want to put the curve through the riser. there's the riser drawn on there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the curved template I already have made. If you don't have one made, I'll show you how to make a curved template really uniform and nice in just a minute. But I have a template, so I'm going to use it because I already built it. All right, so what I do now is I just lay this in here and determine where I want to put the curve in the bow. It's nice to know exactly where your handle is going to be in the bow, so I'm just going to draw that in here. So it's going to come in like this. So I want my curves to be in the actual handle part itself, not in the cutout where the hand goes. So I line this up as nice as I like it. If you want to measure it to make it absolute perfection, go for it. So I'm going to draw a line right through it. You can see here I've put the line through it, and it has the same curve as the face. So I marked it down below right here, and I did the same thing, and I measured up and got my mark here. So I have my mark, I measured up and put a mark here, measured up, put a mark here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the piece of MDF and put the location of this curve on the MDF. I laid the riser on the form. Those two marks that were on the handle here, I came down and I marked those on the MDF here and here. I took my trusty combination square. I got the measure to where it meets on the riser here. I slid down and got the measure and marked there. So it's the same all the way. Now your curve is now going to go, and the marks are on the riser for that too. I lay that down there on the MDF and drew my curve in on the MDF, because what we're going to do now is we're going to have to make this bandsaw cut and then make it as absolutely true as possible without any bumps or grinds. And that's takes a fair amount of time to do. Simple as that. Okay, and so our next step is to bandsaw the curve out of the piece of MDF. Curves to the outside of the table so you can make better curves. If you're going to the inside of the table, sometimes on bigger curves you get stopped by the saw. So set up to cut to the outside. Just stay off your line. Pretty bumpy and grindy, freehanding. I'm sure some of you can probably do a steadier job, but I stayed off the line so that we can go to a drum sander, whether it's in your drill press or on a dedicated drum sander, and we're going to smooth that all out and make it absolutely as perfect as possible. The drum sander is one of our most useful tools. If you can afford to spring for one of these, they're not terribly expensive. This will save you a lot of effort working through a drill press with a 3-inch drum on it, which works. I did that for several years actually with various jigs to do various jobs. Alright, but this is a much better idea, and when you start using templates to do particular sandings, you get a ring made that's got a little edge. See the edge on it? Where the one that's in it is just a washer. This has a little edge, so your templates come up and rub against that, and then you sand, and whatever shape the template is, that sands it perfectly to the shape of the template. And that's kind of what we're doing by making this jig, is we're making the curve for the riser into a template. But we're not using this yet, we're just building the template. These really throw a lot of dust. It's just patience. You got to go, and we're going to sand this curve right down to this line and take any bumps and grinds out we can. All right, let's get started on that. While you're doing this, you can run your hands along here and you can feel any bumps or divots. I got a slight bump right there. It's actually really very good for first efforts because I've been doing this a while, so it's a little easier for me. And if you lose your line slightly, don't worry about it. It's more important that you have a smooth line and not bumps and divots in it. And if the lines move slightly off, once it's in the bow, no one will ever know. I mean, you just can't see it. So get it as smooth as you can. And now it's like a bumpy road. If you have like when a tractor's left a lot of ridges in it, it's bumpy. Well, if you go really fast over it, it smooths out. And it's the same with doing this. By going a little bit faster, it's going to hit the top edges of the bumps and take the top edges off, and you get it smoother a little better. Going real slow is a mistake. Okay, so that's what we have right there. Pretty good curve. Okay, and I'm going to be good with that. Guess I could have turned that off first, couldn't I? All right, now we got to go and draw this curve onto the riser. Just putting a little thin lamination down the middle of the handle here where I put the curve in, where I drew on there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a 1/2 inch group of laminations in there. And so what I'm going to do now is I have my jig, I drew the curved line in there, and I'm going to bring this jig up so I get exactly a 1/2 inch of space from that line. All right, I don't want my lamination to go closer to where the handle cutout is right there. I want it to go into the riser. So the strength, all these 5 laminations, I mean, it's like plywood. It's super, super strength in the middle of a bow handle. And that really allows you to whittle the bow handle down a little better, make a little more comfortable handle, as opposed to having a solid piece of walnut or whatever. I'm getting it lined up, and then what I'm going to do is go ahead and draw that line. It doesn't have to even be in there, but I'll show you why. I want to see where those laminations are going to be. So right in the middle of the bow, where that 1/2 inch is, that's where my laminations are going to be. I need to mark on the other side. So I had it in place. I take my pencil and I'm going to mark right in where the riser comes up on the back side. And the riser comes up on the back side here. All right. Now that's going to allow me to take my support piece and put it right here. Now I'm going to fasten that in place, and then ultimately what's going to happen once it's fastened in place is we're going to put this in place right here, have it in place, and then we can go in and I'll use the router to make a true cut on each of those lines. Flipped it over, placed it on my 2 marks, and now I've measured from the back here so it's uniform, and I've drawn the 2 marks. So what I can do is I can take this, lay it in place, and I can clamp it and glue it in place. I just used some tight bond glue, a very thin amount because it's only got to hold it in place. It doesn't have a lot of force. If you're going to use it a whole lot instead of a one-time deal, you could put pin nails in the back or countersink 3 or 4 screws down it to keep it permanent. This is going to be a one-time use probably, so I just put some tight bond on it. It'll be dry in a half an hour, and in a couple hours we'll come out here and get on the next step. This was the riser block the test one we came up with. Now this is going to go in here like this. We tape it in place here, upside down, and what we're going to do is we're going to take a router bit and we're going to cut about 1/4 to 1/2 inch deep along this edge. It's 1/2 inch because I'm going to put 1/2 inch of laminations in the middle of the riser. The router bit is going to follow this as a guide. So what we're going to do is we're going to tape this in place with two-sided tape. Now if you're going to use a jig all the time, you can make it so you have some kind of clamps for it or whatever, and you can use a jig over and over. I'm only making the one, so I'm just going to make it so it's taped in place, and all I'm going to do is run the router bit along there. So what I've done here, I used two-sided carpet tape. I've laid it down on the flat part of our jig, and I always leave a bit of that tape sticking out the end to start. So what I'm going to do now is you hold it down, make sure it's been pressed in, it fits everywhere really well, best you can, and just slide off the cover, cut it, leave a little bit of your double-sided tape so it's easier to take apart later. Alright, set it aside. Now, I want it to lay flat, so I just take a scrap piece of the same MDF, and I'm going to take this, and I'm just going to slide it up to it, and press it down. Now that holds it all in place, so what we're going to do now, we're going to flip it over, and you can see where our router is going to follow. I want is 1/2 inch gap, 1/4 inch deep. So you need a bearing router bit that looks like this, and this is available at Lowe's or Home Depot. It's a 1/2 inch Freud bit, and I'm only going, you know, 3/8 of an inch deep probably, just enough for the bearing to ride on the guide. I have the jig and the riser there, and I have clamped it down so it doesn't move when I route. I don't want to clamp because I'm going to start my router right here, so I don't want to clamp at this end. So I have a plug in my bench that allows me to push up against it so it stays stationary. And I will route this right out to about here, and then I'll move the clamp and I'll finish it out. Now I have large routers and small routers. You can do it with any router you have. If you're going to use a real heavy router, you're probably going to want to have a secondary support piece on this side to keep it flat the whole way. I prefer to do this kind of work because it's very light, and that I have a small Bosch router. Any small router will do the job. I've put my bit in, I've adjusted it so it's probably 1/4 of an inch or so. All you have to do is have enough to see the gap, because you're going to bandsaw between that gap eventually. Guess I need to plug it in. I flipped it around, so now I'm going to bring it the other way to finish it out. So now you look at that, you can see the riser has that 1/2 inch by about 1/4 inch deep slot cut in it. And it's important that you stay snug to the jig itself. There's our riser. Now we just got to take it off the tape. You can see it's fastened really well. Look at that. I can't even break it loose easily. So if you don't think double-sided tape works, that's a good example. I'll probably have to get a chisel to break it apart. Alrighty, so there we go. I'll get a chisel. I got my knife here. There we go. See that? Just need to get a little leverage in there. So there's the jig. There's the curve the slot. You can see it, okay? And we're going to cut right in between there, down the two sides. You can cut close to either edge, that's fine, but don't nick your edge, because that's going to ultimately be your glue surface, because we got to route that edge again. But I just go straight down the center. So that's next on the list, is the bandsaw down the middle. You can see that's too low. Give yourself about 1/4 inch above your stock with a bandsaw, just enough as you can get your fingers in there. Just by eye is good. So what you see here, you see that we got this edge right here. The next router bit is going to have a bearing to go against your good edge, and it's going to take all this extra off here, and that'll make that perfectly 90 degrees and smooth. And then we do the other side same way, take all that out smooth, and then these two will go together perfectly when you got a 1/2 inch of stock between the two edges. What you take out is what you have to put back. With a 1/2 inch, you'll probably want about 495 or 7 thousandths of an inch instead of a 1/2, because the glue adds to the dimension of the wood, and the wood expands slightly with the glue. So you really, when you do your laminations, we'll make them so they're a hair bit less than a 1/2 inch, to account for wood expansion from the moisture and the thickness of the glue sims. Alright, there's the router table that I'm going to use. You can do it by hand with a router, but I prefer this way. And you can see the bearing on the bottom is going to go right into the gap underneath there, and then it's going to route off all that extra. When the bearing gets all the way down, the blade is flush to the bearing, and it gives us our flush surface. Now you can do this by hand with a handheld router, but I highly recommend that you have another piece of wood the exact same thickness to stabilize the router so you don't tip. Okay. If you look at the edge here, you see I'm not cutting right down, so I have to change the height of my bit slightly because it's not cutting quite deep enough. Just one of those things to do. Okay, there's the surface right there, all plain nice and smooth. Lay in a 1/2 inch of laminations. I'll probably put 5 in there. we'll just thickness those to measure so they look nice. The top piece, when you glue it up, won't be full length. I just cut these to do it, but anyhow, you do this with your blank stock. This is the size you want. And you can see that with this, all you have to do now is make your laminations, glue, and clamp together. Okay, there, that shows the seam a little better. That's how you make a curved lamination. And remember, you can be creative as you like. I've trimmed that riser down and put the laminations in it. And they're just some I had on the shelf. And they're a tad wide, of course, you can see that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to clamp this down, glue it in place, and then I'll just go to the bandsaw, trim that down close, and belt sand it flush. That the curve here of these 5 laminations matches the inside face curve of the bow. That shows how that works, and that you can make the curves go the opposite way, whatever you want. And this will clamp down even tighter once I get some heavy clamps on. These are just squeeze clamps. I never clamp with them. They're not actually good enough. C-clamps or homemade clamps would be better. This is a homemade clamp here, and you can see I've got a hex head nut in the top. This is out of aluminum. I also have them made out of steel, and ultimately they're just going to go underneath here like this. You put a steel rod in here, put your spacer in there, and just tighten them all down. It gets compressed well. If anything, you have to be careful not to over tight and squeeze all your glue out. Now, in doing this kind of work, I fully recommend to use epoxy glue. G2 epoxy is really good. It's available through Lee Valley Tools. And then what I would do, instead of mixing it, I'd mix it with a little bit more of the darker resin. And what that allows it to do is it means when the glue joint is done, it's a little more elastic, and it's a little thicker, and if you have any nuances, it'll fill it in really well, and it'll take a lot more shock and compression than if you make it just 50-50. If you don't have that kind of epoxy available, I would recommend Unibond 800 glue. I don't ever use just straight wood glue for these. I know some people will do that and say it's fine, because when it hardens, it's stronger than the strength of the wood, and while there's truth to that, it also doesn't talk about the mass amount of vibration, and that kind of glue is brittler. It adheres good, but it's brittler, so there'll be more likely to be fracture in that than having something that can yawn with slight movements of, because wood is always moving from humidity changes, and then of course you have the shock of going through the bow every time you shoot an arrow. So that would be my suggestion. Earlier in the video, I told you I'd show you how to make smooth, even curves for laying out bow riser curves or whatever you want. And so that's what I'm doing right now. First, what you're going to need is a simple parallel lamination. This is a 2-inch wide. I make everything 2 inches wide for lots of reasons. So then what I do is I go and I put a notch in each end right in the center like this. I have a string here I made, and it's got small knots there, and it's got a series of knots on the other end. So what we're going to do is we take the single knot and place it in one slot at one end, and then what we're going to do is we're going to flex the lamination whatever we want, and in this case I did a curve that's like this, and you can see how uniform that is. Now obviously if you had a tapered lamination, that wouldn't work for what we're doing. For this is just for a simple curve. Alright, you're going to lay that down. You're going to lay it down, and once you have it, now you hold it down firmly and draw your line, move along, draw your line, press it down, draw along, and then that's going to give you your arc. Now that bow I made with the Celtic curves in it, this is what I did to get the curves. And once you have your arc, of course, you're going to transfer it and move it to a riser jig like we just built. That's just a nice simple method of developing curves. If you're drawing a bow, for a bow form, you can use this same methodology. Do one limb at a time. Do your deflex to a given point. For example, whoa, maybe there's the deflex you want, and you can decide how much. Most active limbs are about 18.5 inches between the riser and the notch. So you'll just adjust this to whatever you want for the amount of deflex, and then I would make a smaller jig and make a curve to make the recurve how I want, so it'd be uniform. And to do that, you can also use a tapered lamination, so that when you do the recurve, it flexes a little more at one end, and then you can draw the whole bow form. And you can slowly develop your own bow design that way, and this will keep everything really uniform to the point where once you've got it bandsawed out, you can smooth it how you want with the drum sander, and it'll be really, really uniform. I've designed a number of bows using this simple methodology. Questions about any part of a method I'm showing you, or if you have something you want to do and you're not sure how to tackle it, then drop me a note under the videos. I look at those, and sometimes it takes me a bit to get back to them because I don't look at them every day. But I will give you the information I have available to do any one task around building a bow. So that's how you do those subtle curves, so they're nice. I can't freehand. If you're really good at freehand, you can draw your curves freehand. I shake too much and vibrate, so it makes it hard having a simple tool that you make yourself. You can buy tools, plastic tools with lead in them and weights, and you put it down and curve it and hold it in place how you want and make all kinds of shapes. It's just more money for something you can do without spending the money, and I'd rather spend that money on buying good quality hardwood or laminations if you're not built. I'm going to explain to you how to make your own jig to build your own laminations. Making a jig to build your own bow laminations isn't hard, but you'll need one of two things. You'll need to have a 3-inch drum sander for your drill press in order to build your own laminations for your bows, as opposed to paying the exorbitant prices for laminations pre-made for you. And I'm not saying they're overcharging, I'm saying it takes time to build this stuff and you need big equipment to put it out in mass, so they're going to charge you. Fair enough. But you can build them really quite economically yourself. Lots of ways to do this. But the simplest and easiest way I know to build these, and I've made a lot of these jigs for the deaf and hard of hearing community. We have a bow building program, and I've worked in, and I built all the jigs and forms and lamination forms. This is the easiest way as opposed to hand filing. So what you need first and foremost is a piece of 1/2 inch, or here I'd prefer 3/4 inch for this lamination jig. But if you have half like I do right now, I cut this when I cut the piece for the riser jig, so I just had it and I made it. But this does the same job. You need that 36 inches long, okay, and 2 inches wide. I make my laminations all 2 inches wide. Later I will bring laminations down to 1 3/4 if that's the width of my bow, or 1 1/2, or what have you, whatever you want. The easiest way is to in fact buy one set of laminations, or if you're going to build a bow, buy 3 sets. So you have 2 sets for your bow and an extra set, or just buy the 2 sets, build your jig, and then use the remaining, take it apart what you're done and use it to build another bow. Lots of opportunity to do it different ways. So what I do is I take the jig. I have a tapered lamination here. I prefer 2/1000ths of an inch per inch. I've seen recurve bows and long bows and stuff with 3/1000ths of an inch per inch taper. And if you're going to do that, you're probably going to be required to build fade outs into the end of the bow to stiffen it up. But anyway, 2/1000 makes a really good bow. You can have one parallel lamination and one tapered lamination, and that makes a really stable, steady shooting bow, easy to tiller bow. And I recommend for your first bow to do it that way, or build with 2 parallel laminations for your first bow. What I'm going to do is I take that lamination and I lay it on top of the jig. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take double-sided tape and lay it down, and again compress the tapered lamination onto the 1/2 inch. If you have a drill press, you're going to need to make a adapter for your drill press. It's about 1 foot long, with a bottom circle cut out for the drum to go into and a perfectly vertical side. You C-clamp that on and you'll run it through sideways, slow and easy, taking very little bit at a time. And you start out taking it off of one end at a time. And I showed how to drum sand laminations in an earlier video, so if you haven't seen that, you can go back to the beginning in the earlier videos where we made tapered laminations. It explains to you how to start the sanding. But I just wanted to show you this is the easy way to do it, and you can just run it through. You adjust it for the thick end of the tapered lamination, bring it in a couple thousandths, and then you draw through and taper off. And I recommend, and I didn't used to do this, and I don't now because I have a different system, but 2-inch double-sided tape, if you lay that down very parallel, I would lay that down and put my piece of stock on it, because as you get low to the thinner parts of the wood, as you can see how it bends, all right, these sometimes can be pushed back and buckle in there. So if you have it to 2-sided tape, it won't do that. And go slow and don't take too much at a time, because you will mess up your lamination. When you're first starting out, don't just cut 4 strips to build your bow. You know, cut yourself 8 strips and build your bow. If you go back to the earlier video, it'll explain to you how to put these laminations together so the grains oppose each other to equalize out. Now, what I also recommend doing is when you get down to the very bottom is run it through, and then what I would do is I would flip it over the other way without any adjustment and change and pull it through again. If for some reason your drill press is not perfectly 90 degrees, then that'll even it out and make it parallel. And don't distress if you measure it and you have 1/1000th of an inch thicker on one edge than the other edge. Because what you'll do is it's 1.5 thousandths wider at the bottom, then the other lamination will be the same. You just flip it over and put the 1.5 at the top. And when it's glued together, it makes that tapered laminations parallel. I hope that information helps you a little bit with something if you're pursuing this. So you got 3 small things to think about. Anyway, you have fun building your bows and be creative. Enjoy the process.